Welcome to the second breakdown of Ascension. In this episode, we're going to be covering environment creation as well as pre-visualization. I've got some really interesting content lined up for you, so without further ado, let's get into how I created Ascension, a Subnautica fan film. We're going to start off with the below zero inspired cave scene that appears at the beginning of the film. I used a cube with the inside faces acting as the cave walls, and then I used a displacer just to add those extra details in. I then created multiple spheres with displacement and then cloned them onto the walls and then chucked everything inside of a volume builder to smooth everything out. I then got to work on these ice shafts, cloning them onto the ground using a polygon selection. I then created a bunch of icicles hanging down from the ceiling. So these are just multiple clusters that I've hand positioned into place. I then worked on creating those beautiful glowing ice crystals on the ground. I've got that interactive render view going so I can tweak the material in real time and really dial in that look that I'm after. Then I brought those models back into the original scene and hand placed them around. I specifically chose positions I knew the camera would focus on, and so I played with composition from those perspectives. You can see the rendered view as well on the right side of my screen, and you can see that nice glowing material as well that I set up previously. With the ice crystals finished, it was then time to create the frosted vase. I used Cinema 4D's hair instancing to clone a bunch of cones that could then be dynamically simulated into place. The material for this was created procedurally, which means no image textures were used, and everything was created from scratch through the material nodes in Redshift. So once I fixed the issue of the bulbs clipping through the plants, I brought them back into the scene and again hand placed them according to the different camera angles and what I think would look nice in the composition. Then I decided to refine those ice shafts, so I created about 7 different variations. Following this, I then worked on the material for the ice, using a gradient to create those nice snow caps on the top. It was then time to get the ground texture going, so I mixed in a few shaders such as a really icy glacier material, which is the more shiny one you can see underneath that main crystal, along with a more diffuse material for the snow. But old mate's a bit cold, so I chucked in a campfire, utilizing Turbulence FD for my fire and smoke sim. Then after tweaking the crystal a bit, I worked on the material for the wall here. So this is a really glossy, translucent, icy material. This was predominantly created procedurally, although I did add some textures later on just to add some more detail. Once again, I'm refining everything. It's all about iteration in the creation process. I've learned that it's completely normal to be unhappy with something in the initial stages, because it's only through that process of repetition and correction that you'll get to a result that you really like. So I'm adding a bit of hand detail there with some vertex maps just to add in some extra curvature. And then I'm going to clone some small rocks onto the ground just to add some further detail into the environment. I randomized the scale because obviously not all rocks are created the same shape. And through some more lighting and material tweaks, here's the final shot. Now we're on to the captain's quarters, where I started off with a basic cube. I used a boolean to create the hole in the wall, and then I used edge loops and extrusions to create those details. Once I made the door frame, I then created these side panels that you see there. And then I cut in those holes using a boolean as well. Next I made some lockers, again starting off with a primitive cube. Then I employed my 3 favorite modeling techniques, which are booleans, edge loops and extrusions. Here's a quick snippet of the Twisty Bridges biome. I went into a lot of detail on this in a video I released earlier this year, so you can check it out here if you would like. I really love the design of the precursor bases because they're super geometric, and once again, I utilized my favorite shape, the cube. It is awesome. But again, just using edge loops, extrusions, inner extrusions. If you guys would like some in-depth tutorials on how to actually model stuff, I'd be more than happy to do so. Just let me know down in the comments and I'll get that going for you. With the bulk of the facility pretty much done, I then created these detailing panels using splines and sweeps. I plan to do this through texturing, but I found that creating actual geometry just looks so much better. Bit of a plot twist here, but we're actually inside of the facility now, so I'm creating the inner Moonpool room. It was super handy because the room is symmetrical, so everything I did on one side was completely identical on the other, which saved a lot of time. If you're trying to get into 3D modeling and this seems super daunting, don't worry because I started in iMovie trailers, and if a guy like me can get into this, then so can you. My advice is to just jump on some online tutorials and get started, because the best way you're going to learn is through creating stuff for yourself. Now, the next logical step was to create the aquarium. So I used that Sea Emperor model that I created in the last video, and I'm using that just as a reference for scale, but I did end up changing that later on. This environment was also symmetrical, which made it much friendlier for modeling. That being said, I probably found this one of the harder environments to make. The devs did a really great job portraying the alien and technological feel of this environment. As a result, I had a fun time challenging myself to achieve the level of detail that the developers did completely from scratch. Previsualization helps me determine the final look of the film. Here we've got the opening scene of the film, and I'm going to swipe through the different iterations that I went through in order to achieve the end result, which is shown right here. Here's the second shot, which doesn't look too bad on its own, but when you compare it to the final result, it just puts the old one to shame. This next shot is actually the waterfall aerial scene, but it didn't start out that way. It was just supposed to be me walking through a bunch of rocks, but I decided that I needed to have something more interesting into the scene, and so I ended up creating a proper waterfall, and there's the final result. Here's an interesting one. I originally planned to have the aurora be found in a massive crater there, as you can see. However, I just wasn't happy with how the scene was feeling, and so I ended up scrapping it completely and going with the inspiration from the concept art, where I've got the main character sort of looking up at this big ship, and there's the final result. Next up is the Aurora's hallway. So I've got a really basic character there, looks nothing like me, but I'm just playing around with the whole composition and the animation as well as the lighting. This was the second camera move that I tried, but I wasn't happy with how the scene looked and felt. So after tweaking the materials and lighting and camera animation, that's the final result. I think it looks leaps and bounds better than what I had before. This is supposed to be me entering the captain's quarters. This next render contains all of the final models for the scene, but I still wasn't happy with the camera animation and everything just felt a bit off and it wasn't dramatic enough. So I ended up going with a front-on camera view instead, which you can see here. It's a bit hard to sympathize with a mask and visor, so I had the character take it off so we can connect with him on a personal level. Here's the famous kelp forest, a really early render, super grainy. And then there's the next progression where I've added in some more refined kelps. And then this is the final result where I've got that beautiful volumetric lighting and the character inside of the sea moth. Here's the Cyclops engine powering up. It's really fun to look back and see just how far these renders have come since the initial stages. This is the second iteration, so I've got the main animation going. And now I've added in some materials and played around with the lighting as well. We're getting closer to that final result. However, you can see once the camera pulls out, everything is black, so I needed to fix that environment. So here we go, here's the next iteration. And we now have some water once we exit. This is the final result. So compared to the previs, it's come a long way. And then we're into the blood kelp zone. This is the original hardware preview of the first shot. There is the next iteration. This was rendered with Arnold. And then this is the final result in Redshift. This is the second shot. And again, you can see the progression. This is through Arnold and then the final result in Redshift. And here's a really funny draft of me turning off the power for silent mode. And then some really early renders in Arnold there, turning off the power. You can see everything super grainy because Arnold struggles with low light. And so switching to Redshift was a huge time saver. I can't imagine if I had to render the whole film using Arnold, it would have taken ages. And here's a really early version of the telepathic communication, and there's a transition into the tree cove. So take a mental screenshot of what that looks like, and then we'll compare it to the final result here, where you can see the old one in the bottom right corner. And here is the previs for the primary containment facility. There is no lava, no nothing, but there's the final result compared to that early animation. And now I'm just going to put the previs and the final side by side. You can see some of the camera animations have changed as well. For example, this scene here, I decided to make it much further up to give that sense of scale. And then here's me diving in. The original was very anticlimactic. The render on the left already has some of the basic materials and lighting set up, but the animation's just not there, so it's pretty funny to look at. And there you've got the establishing shot of the aquarium. And here's a really interesting comparison. That one on the left was super early, so really bad animation. And now it's very sad because the Sea Emperor sadly passes away. And there you can see the green screen compared to the previs. And that final animation where we ramp out and we transition into the Neptune escape rocket. So that wraps up this episode of the behind the scenes of Ascension. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a super fun one to create. Get keen for the next episode where we're going to be taking a look at the green screen, as well as how I created a 3D digital double of myself. Until next time guys, stay safe and hope you have a good one.